Welcome back to another lesson with me, Mr. B. In this lesson, we're going to overview or review the vocabulary and critical concepts that appear in Chapter 1 of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. The language in this book can be very intricate and nuanced, so you may miss these important concepts as you're trying to comprehend what Paulo Freire is saying. So these are the concepts that we're going to overview in this lesson: dehumanization, false charity, true generosity, sub-oppressor, fear of freedom, prescription, adhesion, true solidarity, and internalization. Some of these may sound familiar, as they are definitely related to stuff that we've learned from the Eyes of Oppression, though From the Chinook Fund is rooted in Paulo Freire's work. Starting us off with dehumanization. This is the act of those whose humanity has been stolen, but also those who have stolen it. It's violating one's rights. It's the loss of humanity. Trump used a lot of dehumanization in his language and rhetoric towards undocumented immigrants. He often called those on the border animals, drug cartels, rapists, and other derogatory and dehumanizing or oppressive slurs. And again, this is not limited to the dehumanizing words or actions of one person. This can also be seen on a systemic level, like with why people stand up for things like Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, or even standing with Ukraine. False charity is an attempt to soften the power of the oppressor. It's about aiding the less fortunate, the quote-unquote rejects of life, with the intention of helping the oppressed, but actually not really helping at all. So if you've ever watched the hit anime Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, which is the GIF playing in the back, there are these scientists that can alter matter through alchemy, like constructing and deconstructing. As we can see, the Middle Eastern or Ishvalan man that's deconstructing Edward's arm over here, this character is known as Scar for the X-shaped scar on his forehead, as we can see over there. He's a victim and survivor of genocide. Scar as a character is a religious man, and he believes that he must avenge his brothers and sisters and the people of Ishvala by killing alchemists that contributed to the genocide of his people. Now again, this less fortunate or the rejects of life are his deceased Ishvalans. Scar thinks his revenge is justified, but actually he's just attempting murder on innocent people like the protagonist here, Edward. In this case, it is almost similar to sub-oppression. So when you think of false charity, you question how acts of kindness have unintended consequences, or how charity could possibly reinforce oppression. How could disingenuous actions be self-serving? And so now let's look at some true generosity. This is the opposite of false charity. It is complete solidarity between the oppressor and oppressed, expressing generosity and perpetuating injustice as well, thus fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity. So I want to refer back to Avatar: The Last Airbender here, and this episode, or vignette if you will, the tale of Iroh. Because Iroh, the old man that's seen in each of these panels, represents the epitome of repent and true generosity. The lore of the character Iroh is that he was the crown prince general who stepped away from war, from the loss of his son to bloodshed. He expresses generosity and perpetuates injustice by helping the oppressed. Over here, if you recall in one of the past videos, that same vagabond was trying to mug Iroh. And now, well, they're friends. Spoiler alert, by leading a group that transcends the boundaries of these four nations and races. So with Avatar: Last Airbender, there's the fire, water, air, and earth kingdoms or nations. Iroh seeks philosophy, beauty, and truth, which is part of the definition, fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity. Once again, we will encounter the role of the sub-oppressor. This is when people who have been oppressed internalize the injustice to the point where they also become oppressors. Again, we had other examples of this. In this case, Jet is ambushing the Fire Nation soldiers because he thinks that he's liberating non-Fire Nation citizens by just harming others. And he ends up trying to kill innocent villagers for his own revenge. Similar to Scar, right? Trying to justify their bloodshed to get revenge for their fallen brothers and sisters. Prescription. There's a very early episode of Adventure Time when Finn is trying to be a hero, but these fairies and gnomes say some hurtful words to him. And Jake follows up with, "Oh, don't let those gnomes and their illusions get you down. They're just gnomes and illusions." So the idea of prescription is the imposition of one individual's choice upon another, transforming the consciousness of the person prescribed to into one that conforms with the prescriber's consciousness. Very dense and confusing, right? Lots of really weird phrasing. That's what's in Pedagogy of the Oppressed when explaining what prescription is. In other words, Paulo Freire is trying to say that a prescription is a stereotype or idea of who you should be and how you should act that is imposed onto people both indirectly and directly. Prescriptions are things that are applied to you, like it says here, stereotypes. Indirect prescriptions can be traits of your role model, the traits that you give to them, someone you look up to and be like, wow, they're so great and smart and strong, I want to be like them. What if they're not? Maybe we're prescribing those things to them. If you've seen the movie Encanto, that's also a really great example of how people are prescribed roles or labels that, though it does fit their identity, that's not all of who they are. Or even gender roles that we see on TV, or the media we consume on social media apps, even racist jokes in general. Some direct examples could be peer pressure or family influence, someone or something giving you labels and then they stick. Which brings us to adhesion. Under these circumstances, they cannot consider him, the oppressor, sufficiently clearly to objectivize him to discover him outside of themselves. So what he's saying here with adhesion is that the oppressed is being attached to your oppressor because they control how you see yourself. The prescription given to you by society now sticks. You start to become attached to what you believe you were supposed to be. An example I often give a lot of students, and maybe you've heard my story before, is that when I went through high school, I wanted to go into architecture. I also wanted to go into design and drawing. And a lot of folks said that I didn't have the grades to get into any top programs, like say at Cal Poly. And that stuck. I kind of believed that I wasn't a math person. It's kind of why I'm an English teacher now. So the idea of adhesion is that these hurtful words end up sticking to us, like the ones that were hurting Finn in the previous slide. Fear of freedom. The fear of freedom is the oppressed having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his guidelines. They are fearful of freedom. If that didn't make sense, let's break it down in two parts. Fear of freedom for the oppressed is the fear to assume or own up to one's freedom. The oppressed cannot imagine a life outside of being oppressed. You could almost look at this as a toxic relationship, friendship or not, but let's talk about an intimate relationship. And trigger warning here, but let's say there is a verbally abusive partner and a victim in that relationship. However, the victim does not write off the abuse as abusive. They simply excuse it because they don't want to be lonely. Or they could be so traumatized that they think all people are like that and that there isn't someone else out there that could actually love them differently without verbally abusing them. Like it says here, they cannot imagine a life outside of being oppressed. They're afraid to be free. Whereas on the other hand, with the oppressor fears losing the freedom to oppress. They fear losing their power. They're afraid that if they do not continue having this control, they're going to lose their partner or the person or group that they're controlling. Sometimes you get so caught up in the mistakes or failure that you don't see there's a different way of doing things. So similar to true generosity, but the difference is true solidarity is when the oppressor is in solidarity with the oppressed. Only when he stops regarding them as an abstract category and sees them as persons who have been unjustly dealt with and deprived of their voice, rather than the generosity of an individual, like with Uncle Iroh in the previous slide. This is when both parties, the oppressors and the oppressed, come together as equals. And if you've seen Avatar: The Last Airbender, you know that the main villain and the protagonist are the oppressor and the oppressed. But by the end, as we can see in this image over here, there are no differences. And now they will face the injustices together to help heal the world and usher in a new era of peace. Similar to internalized oppression, internalization looks at how one often hears that they are good for nothing, they're lazy, unproductive, that at the end of the day, they become convinced of their own unfitness. So kind of like those prescriptions that stick to you through adhesion, and this example of Tina Belcher, people say things to her and she's just like, oh, it's okay, I guess I wasn't meant to have a good life. In the example that I gave earlier, not that I was necessarily lazy or unproductive, but I was convinced that I was unfit to apply to schools like Cal Poly to get into an architecture program or to apply to schools that had design programs, just because of one person, which was my high school counselor, told me I wasn't good enough. I hope this helps make sense of the critical concepts that we'll encounter in Chapter 1 of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's a dense reading and you may miss Paulo Freire's explanations of these words. All right, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.